February 24, 1986, Van Nuys, California. A townhouse condo behind a locked gate, quiet in the early evening. John Ruetten walks through his own front door after work and finds broken glass on the driveway behind him. Inside, his wife of 3 months is on the living room floor. She has been shot 3 times, once through a folded quilted blanket, pressed against her to muffle the sound. There is a bite mark on her arm. Investigators would spend 23 years calling this a burglary. The truth was simpler and far more disturbing. The person who killed Sherri Rasmussen had a badge, a gun issued by the same department that would spend more than 2 decades failing to catch her, and a name that Sherri's own father had already given detectives, in person, within days of the murder. For 23 years, that name sat in a file cabinet, while the woman it belonged to kept climbing the ranks of the Los Angeles Police Department. This is the story of how that happened, and of the young nurse whose life became, for 2 decades, an unsolved case number instead of the future she'd spent her whole life building. If you want to see how long it took the lap to look in the mirror, hit like before we go on. Sherri Ray Rasmussen was born February 7, 1957, in Walla Walla, Washington, and raised in Arizona, one of 3 daughters born to Nels and Loretta Rasmussen. She graduated from Thunderbird Adventist Academy and started college at La Sierra University at just 16 years old. After her freshman year, she was accepted into the nursing program at Loma Linda University and transferred there, the first step in what would become an unusually fast, unusually accomplished career. By the time most of her peers were finishing their first jobs, Sherri had already worked in the coronary care unit at UCLA Medical Center, earned a master's degree in nursing from UCLA in 1980, and been promoted to head nurse of the university's coronary care and observation unit. She was appointed an unpaid assistant clinical professor of nursing on top of her clinical work, lecturing to nursing students in her spare time. By her late 20s, she had become director of nursing at Glendale Adventist Medical Center, teaching classes and giving presentations to fellow nurses along the way. Colleagues who worked with her would later describe her as the kind of person who made competence look effortless, brilliant without seeming to try, someone who ran a hospital nursing program at an age when most people are still finding their footing. She was also, by every account, a genuinely kind person, hard-working, warm, the sort of older sister who showed up. Friends and colleagues remembered her as someone who mentored younger nurses without being asked, and who took obvious pride in seeing the people she trained succeed. Her sister Teresa Lane would remember, years later, being able to see in Sherri's wedding photographs just how happy she was that day. That happiness had been a long time coming. After building her career, Sherri's father Nels bought her a condominium in Van Nuys, one with a drive-in garage, specifically so she wouldn't have to walk along the street alone after late hospital shifts. She paid him rent equal to his own mortgage payment, but the choice of home was entirely about keeping his daughter safe. It's worth sitting with that detail, because it tells you plainly what kind of relationship Sherri had with her father. Close, protective, practical. That relationship would define the rest of this story every bit as much as anything that happened inside that condo, because Nels Rasmussen was about to spend more than 2 decades refusing to let his daughter's case go cold, long after everyone paid to investigate it already had. Sherri met John Ruetten, a mechanical engineer, at a party in June of 1984, and they began dating shortly after. Where the relationship became complicated was in what Sherri didn't yet fully know, that Ruetten had a college on-again, off-again history with a young woman who was, by then, a Los Angeles police officer, and that this woman was not by any reasonable measure over him. When that woman confronted Sherri directly at her own workplace, months before the wedding, telling her plainly that she and John were still sleeping together and that she'd be waiting when the marriage inevitably failed, Sherri didn't flinch. She calmly told her that wouldn't be necessary. It's a small exchange, but it says everything about who Sherri Rasmussen was under pressure. Steady, unbothered by intimidation, entirely secure in the life she'd built. She married John Ruetten in November of 1985, in front of family and friends, who, by every account, had never seen her happier. Before leaving for their honeymoon, The couple installed a burglar alarm in the condo her father had bought her and set the code to 1123, their wedding anniversary. A choice a friend gently warned was too easy to guess. It was meant to be one more layer of protection in a life Sherri had every reason to believe was, finally, completely her own. Subscribe now, because it took the Los Angeles Police Department 23 years to admit what happened next, and you're going to want to follow this case all the way to the end. The night before, on February 23rd, one of John's friends from UCLA had stopped by the condo. The Ruettans normally came and went through the attached garage, but that visit ran through the front door instead, and John, without thinking much of it, forgot to lock it again afterward. On the morning of Monday, February 24th, 1986, John Ruettan left the condo he shared with Sherri at around 7:20 a.m. for his job at Micropolis, a hard drive manufacturer in Chatsworth, making a couple of brief stops along the way. Sherri was scheduled to give a motivational presentation that day at Glendale Adventist, an assignment she privately thought was a waste of time. She'd hurt her back in an aerobics class the day before and told John she might just call in sick instead. It was an entirely ordinary Monday morning goodbye. At 9:45, a neighbor noticed the Ruettans' garage door standing open, with no car inside. About 15 minutes later, John made the first of several calls home that would go unanswered all day. Odd, he thought, since both of them always turned on the answering machine when the condo was empty. Sherri's sister, a nurse at another hospital, called too and also got no answer. Around noon, two men working in the complex found a purse lying nearby and handed it to a neighbor. It was Sherri's, though at that point, nobody thought much of a misplaced bag turning up outside. A maid cleaning a nearby unit later recalled hearing what sounded like two people fighting around 12:30 that afternoon, followed by a crash. She assumed it was a domestic argument next door and didn't call anyone. By the time John left work that evening, an entire day had passed without a single word from his wife, and the unease that had started as mild irritation at an unanswered phone had curdled into something closer to dread. When John came home that evening, he found broken glass on the driveway and Sherri's BMW gone from the garage. Strange, he thought, since she'd planned to stay in all day. He let himself in, calling for her, and found no answer. Inside, on the living room floor, he found his wife dead. There were unmistakable signs of a struggle: a shattered porcelain vase, a toppled cabinet, a bloody handprint beside the burglar alarm's panic button, cord that appeared to have been used in an attempt to bind her. She had defensive wounds on her hands and arms, and a bruise on her face that would later be traced to the muzzle of a gun. She had been shot 3 times, the gun fired through a folded quilt to muffle the sound. She had, by every indication investigators found that night, fought for her life for a long time before losing it. There was no sign that the front door had been forced. Whoever came into Sherri Rasmussen's home that morning did not break in. She either opened the door herself or already had a way inside. In the confusion of that first night, officers asked John to remove his shirt so they could check his back and arms for scratches, a routine step, given how visibly Sherri had fought back. None were found. It would not be the last time that night's small, half-remembered details mattered far more than anyone realized at the time. Detectives arriving at the scene reached a conclusion within hours, and it would define the case for the next 23 years. This was a burglary interrupted. Sherri's attire, a bathrobe, nightgown, and underwear, suggested she hadn't been expecting anyone. A stack of stereo equipment sat piled at the base of the stairs, as if a burglar had begun gathering valuables before being surprised. Her jewelry had been left untouched, but her car was gone. Only one other item from the home appeared to be missing: the couple's marriage license, which Sherri's mother believed her daughter had likely been carrying in her purse to help consolidate their bank accounts. Investigators also noted that the killing had happened in broad daylight, in the middle of a gated complex, surrounded by other occupied units. An unusually bold time and place for a stranger to choose, though nobody weighed that oddity heavily against the burglary theory at the time. An autopsy found that any one of the 3 gunshot wounds would eventually have proven fatal on its own. Sherri's face bore 15 separate injuries, including a laceration between her upper lip and jaw, consistent with being struck hard and repeatedly. Ballistics experts later identified the ammunition as Federal .38 Special Plus P, a round favored at the time by lapped officers who carried a .38 as their department-approved backup weapon, a detail nobody in 1986 thought to connect to anything. The investigating criminalist noted a bite mark on her arm and swabbed it for blood typing. 1986 forensic technology, decades before that swab would matter in a courtroom. A tool mark left on Sherri's body, consistent with the muzzle of a .38 revolver, was visible, photographed, and noted in the autopsy file that same year. It would not actually be matched to a weapon for 23 more years. Lead detective Lyle Mayer quickly ruled out John Ruetten as a suspect. At a first interview the night of the murder, Ruetten did not bring up Lazarus at all. It was only at a second interview the following morning, after detectives themselves raised the possibility that a jealous former lover might be involved, that he gave them her name, though even then, he left out the final sexual encounter between them and the confrontation at Sherri's hospital that had followed it, details that would not become public for another 26 years. Nels and Loretta, for their part, needed no prompting at all. They told Mayer about the woman who had been harassing their daughter for months, a former girlfriend of John's, now a Los Angeles police officer. Mayer made a note of it. He did not pursue it. When Nels raised the woman's name again, Mayer told him, "There's nothing there." Instead, the investigation settled on the idea of two burglars, a man and a woman working together. Mayer reasoned that real burglars didn't typically steal a car to leave in, since they usually brought their own vehicle to haul stolen goods. To him, that meant there had to be a second person along to drive it away. His partner, Detective Steve Hooks, privately found the bite marks strange. In his experience, bite marks inflicted during a struggle were far more often left by women than men. But since men occasionally bit their victims too, the two-burglar theory held. Detectives were further encouraged in that theory by an unrelated burglary reported later in the same part of the valley, in which one of two reported suspects had reportedly been carrying a handgun that could plausibly have been a .38, like the one used on Sherri. 11 days after the murder, Sherri's BMW turned up abandoned about 2 miles from the condo, unlocked, with the keys still in the ignition. 4 fingerprints in the car belonged to neither Sherri nor John, but a search of the surrounding area produced nothing else. To Mayer, the car's location, in a neighborhood where known burglars lived, only reinforced the theory. That April, a man arrested during an unrelated burglary in a similar Van Nuys condo looked, for a moment, like the break the case needed. His fingerprints didn't match, and he was ruled out. There were problems with the burglary theory from the start, even if no one acted on them at the time. Sherri Rasmussen was 6 feet tall, in excellent physical condition, and by her father's estimation, would have been extraordinarily difficult for anyone to subdue quietly in close quarters. Mayer himself told Nels that the struggle appeared to have lasted anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, an extraordinarily long time for burglars, supposedly interested only in grabbing valuables and leaving. Nels doubted too that a struggle of that length would have been necessary at all if the person doing the fighting had been a man. His daughter, he reasoned, would have had a real chance against one attacker, which was exactly why it had taken so long, and whoever fired the fatal shots had taken the time to press a quilt against the gun to muffle the sound. The deliberate act of someone trying not to be heard, not the panicked improvisation of a startled thief. Criminalists at the scene also noted a bloody, thumb-shaped mark on a digital disc player sitting atop the stacked stereo equipment, a print most likely left by whoever staged that pile. It was never properly collected or photographed in usable detail, and the disc player itself was never taken into evidence at all. The suspected burglars were never identified. A follow-up newspaper story ran 8 months later. The Rasmussen family posted reward money. Nothing came of either. The lapse of the mid-1980s was consumed by gang violence and the early crack epidemic sweeping Los Angeles, and had little attention left over for a case that, on paper, already had a working theory. It was also a department already absorbing other officer scandals that year. Two lapped officers were on trial in 1986 for a murder-for-hire plot, and another would soon be arrested for stealing luxury yachts before being convicted in two more contract killings. A fourth officer, quietly suspected of murdering a civilian, was, in that climate, not necessarily a story anyone in a position of authority was eager to chase down. The Rasmussens later said that when they called the Van Nuys detective's office for updates, they were often put on hold indefinitely or simply hung up on. By the end of 1986, without an arrest, without even a formally named suspect, Sherri Rasmussen's murder had gone cold. John Rutten moved out of the condo within a month, unable to keep living there, and eventually moved back in with his parents in San Diego. Nels and Loretta Rasmussen, meanwhile, refused to let the case rest. A year after the murder, they held a news conference to renew their reward offer and press for action. Nels wrote directly to Lap Chief Daryl Gates about the woman he believed was responsible. Detectives told him he watched too much television. He kept publicizing the reward anyway, and later worked with producers on a segment for the short-lived television series Murder One, inspired by his daughter's case. In 1988, Sherri's other sister suggested the family approach true crime writer Ann Rule, a fellow Seattle resident, about writing a book on the case. Rule was interested and met with the Rasmussens. Nels told her everything he suspected about the lapped officer. Rule asked a retired detective friend who helped with her research to look into it quietly. Within days, she told Nels the case was, in her friend's words, too hot to handle, and she would not be writing about it after all. Lead detective Lyle Mayer retired in 1991. His partner, Steve Hooks, was transferred to another division a few years later. The new detective assigned to the file told Nels he had no intention of following up on Mayer's old notes and doubted any new leads would surface. In 1993, with DNA testing finally becoming available, Nels offered to personally pay for it to be run on the evidence. He was told police needed a named suspect before they could authorize testing, a suspect they had already been handed, twice, in person, years earlier. Records show detectives did briefly revisit the file that October, after a year and a half of complete inactivity, ordering new fingerprint comparisons and checking whether any recently paroled offenders might fit the burglary theory. Nothing came of it. In 1997, a woman contacted police after her former co-worker, Sherri's own secretary, had once described a January 1986 confrontation between Sherri and the same lapped officer, right in Sherri's own office. No one followed up before the secretary died 3 years later. For the better part of 2 decades, the file that could have named Sherri Rasmussen's killer sat largely undisturbed, while the officer her father kept naming continued climbing the ranks of the department meant to catch her. Her name was Stephanie Lazarus, and to understand how she evaded suspicion for 23 years, you have to understand how completely she had built herself into exactly the kind of person nobody suspects. Lazarus met John Rutten at UCLA in the late 1970s, where both lived in Dykstra Hall, and Lazarus, a Simi Valley native majoring in political science and sociology, played on the university's junior varsity women's basketball team. Their relationship was casual and on and off for years. Rutten later testified they had sex an estimated 20 to 30 times between 1981 and 1984, and that he never considered her his girlfriend, even as friends noticed she seemed to take it far more seriously than he did. After graduating in 1982, Lazarus briefly considered law school before choosing the lapped instead, joining at a moment when the department was actively recruiting women following a sex discrimination lawsuit. She graduated the academy in 1983 and was posted to the Lapped's Hollywood division, a rough assignment still reeling from a corruption scandal that had gotten 14 officers fired. Chief Daryl Gates himself later wrote that Hollywood seemed to breed misconduct more than other divisions, describing something like an almost carnival atmosphere that suggests, here, anything goes. It was there that Lazarus's own training officer allegedly propositioned her repeatedly. Her refusals led to workplace rumors that she was gay. When that officer was later investigated for stealing narcotics, Lazarus was called to testify at his disciplinary hearing. A diary she kept during this period shows a young officer working hard to be accepted, adopting an increasingly detached, businesslike attitude even toward the city's most brutalized crime victims. The same instinct, colleagues would later realize, that let her walk through her own crime scene investigation for years without flinching. She purchased a Smith & Wesson .38 caliber revolver through the department as her personal backup firearm, standard practice for an officer at the time. By the summer of 1985, Lazarus's world was falling apart in a way almost none of her colleagues noticed. Not long before, unaware he'd already begun dating other women in earnest, she had thrown Ruetten a surprise party for his 25th birthday. She learned that summer that John, whom she still described as her boyfriend during police academy training, and whose photo she still had from a company Christmas party 2 years earlier, had gotten engaged to a nurse named Sherri Rasmussen. Her diary entry from that week survives. She wrote that she no longer felt like working, now that she'd learned John was getting married, adding that her concentration was like mice 10. That night, she woke her roommate, a fellow officer, just to talk about it. He later said he'd never seen her cry before. Weeks later, shortly before Ruetten moved in with his fiancée, Lazarus visited him one final time. They had sex. To give her closure, Ruetten testified years afterward. He never told Sherri. It didn't give her closure. That July or August, on a day off, Lazarus drove to Glendale Adventist Medical Center and confronted Sherri directly at her workplace, telling her that she and John were still intimate and that she'd be there to pick up the pieces when the marriage inevitably failed. When Sherri calmly told her that wouldn't be necessary, Lazarus left her with a line that Sherri would repeat to her father, though never file a police report over, "If I can't have John, no one else will, including you." The pattern didn't stop there, and this is the detail that, in hindsight, should have ended this case in 1986 rather than 2009. In January of 1986, weeks before the murder, Lazarus brought a pair of skis to the Ruettens' condo and asked John to wax them. Despite Sherri's objections, he agreed. A few days later, while John was at work, Lazarus returned to collect them, in uniform, armed, and let herself onto the property. Later that same month, Sherri came downstairs one morning after John had left for work and found Lazarus standing in their living room, in uniform. Sherri asked her to leave, and she did. Sherri told her father about both incidents. She did not believe reporting an lapped officer to the lapped would accomplish anything. After the family's February trip to visit her parents in Tucson, Sherri confided to Nels one more time. She believed Lazarus was following her on the street, sometimes disguised as a young man. There was no formal charge, no restraining order, no institutional record of any of this, beyond a father's repeated, dismissed phone calls. Because in 1986, a police officer, accused by a civilian of harassing another civilian, simply wasn't investigated by her own department, and there was no outside mechanism that could have forced the issue. That gap, not a legal loophole exactly, but an institutional one, is a large part of why Stephanie Lazarus was able to walk away from Sherri Rasmussen's murder and keep working. It's worth noting, too, that by late 1985, Lazarus had appeared, to her friends and co-workers, to be moving on, taking a part-time security job at a nearby college, dating again, even drafting a personal ad in her diary. Whatever was still unresolved in her, she kept it well hidden from almost everyone around her. And work she did. Lazarus stayed on the force, married a fellow officer named Scott Young whom she'd met teaching a drug education class, adopted a daughter with him, and was promoted to detective in 1994. She became an instructor at the police academy and, eventually, one of only 2 detectives in the country's only full-time art theft unit, once earning local media attention for helping recover a bronze statue stolen from the Carthay Circle neighborhood. Colleagues described her as vivacious, hard-working, and supportive, a cop's cop, as one later put it, though a few also privately admitted that her temper, when it flared, had earned her the unflattering nickname Lazarus behind her back. During the 1990s, Lazarus was twice assigned to the Van Nuys division. the exact office where Sherri Rasmussen's murder file was kept, and colleagues recalled she frequently volunteered for unsupervised overnight shifts there. In 2004, criminalist Jennifer Francis finally got a usable DNA profile from the old bite mark evidence, confirming the killer was female and demolishing the two male burglar theory once and for all. She asked her supervising detective whether a third-party female mentioned in the file, a woman who'd harassed the victim before the murder, had ever been investigated. He told her, "Oh, you mean the lap detective," and explained that this woman was effectively off-limits to her inquiry. No one followed up. The evidence went back into storage. Somewhere, quietly, without ever being formally accused of anything, Stephanie Lazarus's own department had come within one conversation of naming her and let it go. In March of 2008, Van Nuys homicide detective Jim Nuttall arrived at work to find a box with two old case files sitting on the floor near his desk. One was Sherri Rasmussen's. He read through it and, with his partner, Detective Pete Barber, reached the same conclusion Jennifer Francis had reached 4 years earlier, and nobody had acted on. This wasn't a burglary. Francis, working the case in 2004, had faced her own obstacles just locating the evidence at all. The original bite mark swab wasn't logged in the coroner's office's newer computer system, and it took a search of the lab's old chest freezers before anyone found it, still sealed in its original 1986 envelope. The DNA evidence pointed to a woman. The staging didn't add up. A jewelry box sitting untouched in plain sight. A gated complex where burglars would have been easily seen. A front door that showed no sign of forced entry. Even the stack of stereo equipment by the stairs looked wrong. If the struggle had genuinely continued from upstairs to down, that stack should have been scattered in the chaos. It looked, instead, like someone had arranged it afterward, to make the scene read as an interrupted robbery. A bloodstain on a record player at the top of that stack, left by someone wearing gloves, turned out under later testing to be Sherri's own blood, meaning the equipment had been staged after she was already dead. It helps to understand what the DNA evidence could and couldn't do for them at this stage. Years earlier, Jennifer Francis had run the bite mark sample against CODIS, the FBI's national database of DNA profiles collected from convicted offenders, essentially checking whether the saliva matched anyone already in the system. It hadn't. CODIS is only useful, by design, if a suspect's profile is already sitting in the database. Stephanie Lazarus, a decorated police detective with no criminal record whatsoever, was never going to turn up there no matter how many times the sample was run. What the testing could do, and did do, was rule out an entire theory of the crime by confirming the saliva belonged to a woman. Finding the actual person that DNA belonged to was still going to take old-fashioned detective work, a name, a hunch, and a way to get a comparison sample voluntarily, without a warrant that might spook a suspect who knew exactly how warrants worked. Working from the case's 4-volume murder book, Nuttall and Barber built a list of 5 women who might have had a motive. Sherri's sister, her mother, a close friend, a nurse with workplace friction with Sherri, all cleared through DNA within weeks, and a 5th name, an old girlfriend of John Ruetten's from college. When Nuttall called Ruetten to ask about her, Ruetten mentioned, almost in passing, that she was a police officer and that he'd actually given lapsed investigators her name decades earlier, a conversation that Nuttall was stunned to learn she wasn't just any officer. Stephanie Lazarus had, by then, been promoted to detective herself, working in the department's small, respected art theft unit. It meant that solving this case would not simply mean catching a killer. It would mean accusing one of their own, someone with an unblemished record, full knowledge of how homicide investigations worked, and colleagues throughout the department who would vouch for her without a second thought. This is the part of the story that usually involves a laboratory breakthrough. A decades-old sample finally cracked open by new genetic genealogy technology, the way a similar cold case would later break open the hunt for California's Golden State Killer. This case is different, and it matters that it's different. The DNA technology that eventually convicted Stephanie Lazarus wasn't a new invention. It was a straightforward, decades-established forensic tool, comparing one person's genetic profile directly against a sample from a crime scene. What had been missing for 23 years wasn't the science. It was a set of detectives willing to point that science at a fellow officer. Because Lazarus was still on the job, one of only 2 detectives in the country's only full-time art theft unit, well-liked, active in the department's Women Officers Association, with no disciplinary history whatsoever, and her own husband also worked as a detective out of Van Nuys, though not one personally known to Nuttall or Barber. The 2 men kept their new investigation a closely guarded secret, referring to her only as number 5 in their own notes, and inventing cover stories to justify pulling a 20-year-old personnel file. They reasoned through how a police officer might commit a murder and make it look like an interrupted burglary. She'd do it on a day off, which records confirmed Lazarus had been. She wouldn't use her issued duty weapon, since losing one carried serious departmental penalties, but a personal backup gun would barely be missed. And she'd know exactly how much staging it would take to satisfy an overworked detective already primed to see a burglary. The federal 38+P rounds recovered from Sherri's body, the kind of ammunition so many lapped officers carried in exactly that era, suddenly looked less like a coincidence and more like a lead. State records showed Lazarus had, in fact, owned a .38 caliber revolver at the time, and that 13 days after the murder, she had reported it stolen not to her own department's armorer, as policy required, but to the police in Santa Monica, near a popular pier. Investigators came to believe she'd thrown it into the Pacific. Without the gun, DNA was the only way left to tie her to the crime, and they couldn't simply ask for a warrant without tipping her off. So they waited for an opportunity. Nels Rasmussen, still calling occasionally after 22 years, told Nuttall the same thing he'd told Mayer and Hooks decades earlier, that this woman had never really stopped showing up in his daughter's life. This time, someone finally listened. Investigators quietly assigned a surveillance team to Lazarus's daily routine, waiting for a moment when she would voluntarily throw something away. While off duty, Lazarus visited a Costco store in Simi Valley and threw away a cup she'd been drinking from. Surveilling officers retrieved it from the trash. The saliva on the discarded straw was tested against the decades-old bite mark sample. It matched. There was, this time, a real number to put behind the match, something the CODIS search years earlier had never been able to offer, since it could only report a hit or a miss, not a probability. When criminalist Jennifer Francis later testified about the DNA comparison, she told the jury the genetic markers shared between the bite mark sample and Stephanie Lazarus's DNA would be expected to turn up in roughly 1 in 402 quadrillion people, a figure she illustrated by noting that number was roughly equivalent to the combined population of 100 million Earths. It was, in the most literal statistical sense, as close to certain as forensic science gets. But confirming the match privately was one thing. Arresting a serving lap detective for murder without incident was another. Homicide Supervisor Rob Bubb quietly briefed his chain of command, all the way up to Chief William Bratton, along with senior prosecutors from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office. The case was handed to the Elite Robbery Homicide Division, which handles many of the department's highest-profile investigations. On the day of the arrest, dozens of officers were briefed only that a search warrant would be executed somewhere outside city limits and told to wait in Simi Valley, near Lazarus's home, without being told whose home it was. On the morning of June 5, 2009, Detective Daniel Jaramillo approached Lazarus at her desk at LAPT headquarters and asked for her help. He told her a man in custody downstairs claimed to have information about a stolen artwork, her specialty. It meant walking down to the building's jail facility, where she'd have to surrender her gun to enter. That was deliberate. Chief Bratton wanted her disarmed before anyone told her why she was really there. In an interview room, Jaramillo and a second detective, Greg Stearns, both chosen specifically because they had no personal connection to Lazarus, spun out the conversation slowly for nearly an hour, circling toward Sherri Rasmussen's name only gradually. Lazarus, a 25-year veteran who knew exactly what an interrogation looked like from the inside, claimed at first to barely remember the case at all. Bit by bit, her memory improved. When the detectives finally mentioned they might have DNA evidence from the scene and asked whether she'd be willing to provide a sample, Lazarus grew agitated. "Am I on candid camera or something?" she asked them. "This is insane." She said she needed to speak with somebody first, stood up, and walked out of the room, where other officers were waiting to arrest her. Officers searched her Simi Valley home the same day. Inside, they found a diary from the mid-1980s, filled with entries about her love for John Ruetten and her devastation over his engagement. Her home computer showed repeated internet searches for his name, conducted years after the murder, long after any reasonable person would have called that relationship over. Back at LAPT headquarters, colleagues were stunned. Nobody, one detective told reporters afterward, had seen this coming. People who worked with Lazarus described her as a good cop, not someone anyone imagined capable of this. A major elder abuse and real estate fraud case she'd been building as an art theft investigator had to be quietly dropped. No prosecutor wanted to build a case around a lead detective facing murder charges of her own. Lazarus was permitted to retire from the department rather than be fired, entitling her to a pension she continued collecting from behind bars. Stephanie Lazarus's trial opened in Los Angeles County Superior Court in early 2012, 26 years after Sherri Rasmussen's murder, before a jury of 8 women and 4 men. The courtroom was packed most days with reporters. The case had, by then, been simmering in the local press for nearly 3 years. Prosecutor Shannon Presby opened with a line that would follow the case through every headline that spring: a bite, a bullet, a gun barrel, and a broken heart. Sitting at the defense table was attorney Mark Overland, who had spent 3 years unsuccessfully trying to get the case thrown out entirely, arguing the decades-old evidence denied his client a fair chance to defend herself, and that her pre-arrest interview statements at Parker Center had been unconstitutionally compelled. Judge Robert J. Perry had rejected every one of those motions before testimony ever began. Prosecutors built their case around a single, simple idea: that Sherri Rasmussen had been killed for standing in the way of a relationship that, in Lazarus's mind, was never really over, and that the decades afterward only confirmed it. From the 1989 Hawaii reunion with Ruetten, to the occasional visits and sex that continued into the early 1990s, to the internet searches for his name, Lazarus was still running as late as the late 1990s. Lazarus, prosecutors argued, had never truly let go, before the murder or after it. The rawest testimony came early, from John Ruetten himself. He wept on the stand more than once, telling jurors how he'd found his wife's body, and admitting that sleeping with Lazarus after he was already engaged to Sherri had been, in his words, a mistake. Overland's cross-examination steered hard back toward the original burglary theory, pointing to the unrelated Van Nuys burglary case from months after the murder, and to a bloody fingerprint on the wall that had never been fully analyzed, suggesting other suspects had never been properly ruled out. He also pressed Ruetten on how many other details from that period he had never volunteered to the original detectives, including, jurors learned, the final sexual encounter with Lazarus and the confrontation at Sherri's hospital that followed it. Prosecutors also called witnesses meant to establish that the confrontations Sherri had described to her father were not an isolated flash of temper, but a pattern. Jurors heard second-hand accounts of Lazarus letting herself into the Ruetten's home in uniform, and of the hospital confrontation, in which she'd warned Sherri that she'd be waiting when the marriage failed. Combined with entries from Lazarus's own 1985 diary, including one written the night she learned of the engagement, in which she described her concentration as having collapsed entirely, prosecutors argued the jury didn't need to guess at motive. Lazarus had documented it herself, in her own handwriting, more than 2 decades before anyone thought to ask. Then came the forensic case. Jennifer Francis walked the jury through her rediscovery of the decades-old bite mark swab, misplaced for years, finally located in a coroner's office freezer, and the 1 in 400 quadrillion match to Lazarus's DNA. A second analyst testified that a separate sample, lifted from the straw Lazarus had discarded at Costco, matched that same profile as well, effectively giving the jury 2 independent DNA confirmations rather than 1. Overland attacked the older evidence's handling as vigorously as he could, showing jurors photographs of the sample's storage envelope, sealed with evidence tape at the top, but visibly torn open at the bottom, a flaw the crime lab's own supervisor had once summarized as, simply, "We've got a problem." It was, Overland argued, more than enough doubt to make the original 1986 sample unreliable, whatever the newer Costco sample might show. The prosecution also called retired FBI profiler Mark Safarik, an expert in burglary behavior, who told jurors that the staged crime scene bore none of the real hallmarks of an actual break-in, reinforcing, from an outside expert's perspective, everything Nuttall and Barber had concluded back in 2008. Overland wanted to question Safarik specifically about the unrelated Van Nuys burglary case from later that year, hoping to show genuine burglars really had been active in the area at the time. Judge Perry limited how far that line of questioning could go, a ruling Overland would challenge again on appeal. Over 2 days presenting the defense case, Overland pushed back against the prosecution's portrait of a woman consumed by jealousy, calling several of Lazarus's own friends to testify that she'd shown no unusual distress around the time of the murder. He read jurors' contemporary excerpts from her own diary, showing her dating several different men that same year, arguing a woman actively moving on with her life made an unlikely murderer. A defense fingerprint expert testified that some prints recovered at the scene didn't match Lazarus at all, leaving open, Overland suggested, the possibility that someone else had been inside that condo. Both sides swung hard in closing arguments. After showing jurors photographs of Sherri's battered face one final time, prosecutor Paul Nuys told them plainly that it hadn't been a fair fight. This was prey caught in a cage with a predator. He reminded the panel that Lazarus's own training as a police officer was what had allowed her to stage the scene convincingly enough to fool investigators for 23 years. The same skills the jury had just spent weeks watching Overland use in her defense. Overland, in turn, dismissed the prosecution's case as circumstantial fluff and fill, insisting that only the DNA evidence carried any real weight, and that the DNA evidence had been compromised by decades of questionable storage. He moved for a mistrial after Nuys made a remark he felt improperly referenced Lazarus's decision not to testify in her own defense. Judge Perry denied the motion, ruling that the comment had not crossed that line. After several days of deliberation, the jury convicted Stephanie Lazarus of first-degree murder on March 8, 2012. Set against 23 years of dismissed phone calls and dead-end leads, a matter of days felt almost startlingly fast, proof, to the family watching from the gallery, of just how solid the case had finally become once someone was willing to build it. She was sentenced more than 2 months later, on May 11, 2012, to 27 years to life, the maximum available under California law, with credit for time already served since her 2009 arrest, meaning she would not be eligible for parole consideration for roughly another 2 decades under the sentence as originally handed down. The hearing lasted less than half an hour. Sherri's mother, Loretta, addressed the court directly, describing the family's enduring grief in stark, simple terms. "Every day, we miss her laughter and her love." Both of Sherri's sisters, Teresa and Connie, spoke as well. Deputy District Attorney Shannon Presby read a statement on behalf of Sherri's father, Nels, who did not address the court himself that day. John Ruetten, addressing the judge through tears, said Sherri had spent her final minutes simply trying to save her own life. Sherri's former roommate asked to read a statement of her own. Because she wasn't immediate family, Judge Perry didn't allow it. Lazarus, dressed in an orange jail jumpsuit rather than street clothes, her hair unbrushed, kept her head down through most of the proceeding and showed no visible emotion as the sentence was read into the record. Her husband, Scott Young, sat in the gallery with other family members. Nobody from her side of the room chose to speak on her behalf. Part 10. Aftermath, Tribute and Close. Lazarus appealed, arguing the search warrant was improperly issued, that her pre-arrest statements had been unconstitutionally compelled, and that the aging DNA technology used against her deserved closer scrutiny. A 3-judge appellate panel unanimously upheld her conviction in 2015, and the California Supreme Court declined to hear any further challenge. As the case unfolded in later years, journalist Matthew McGough, whose 2019 book, The Lazarus Files, remains the most exhaustive account of the investigation, documented evidence that parts of the original case file appeared to have been altered or gone missing entirely sometime after 1986, during years when Lazarus herself had access to the Van Nuys Detective Bureau, where it was stored. No one has ever been charged in connection with that. Sherri's parents sued the city over the original investigation's failures. The suit was dismissed as filed too late. The criminalist, Jennifer Francis, sued separately, alleging she'd faced retaliation for pursuing the Lazarus lead back in 2004. A jury ultimately found in the city's favor. Nuys Rasmussen died in 2020, having lived to see his daughter's killer convicted, but never fully answered for why it took 23 years. Before his death, he recorded a video statement for any future parole hearing, saying of his daughter's injuries, "It's almost like she wanted to destroy the beauty that Sherri exuded." That statement would be played in 2024, when a state parole panel initially recommended Lazarus's release under a newer law covering crimes committed by young offenders. Lazarus was 25 in 1986, only for Governor Gavin Newsom to request full board review and see that recommendation rescinded. A follow-up request was denied again in 2025. A parole commissioner, citing inconsistencies between the physical evidence and the account Lazarus herself had finally given at a 2023 hearing, where, for the first time in 37 years, she admitted to the killing outright. She is next eligible to apply in 2028. The case became the subject of national attention long before that. Profiled at length in The Atlantic and Vanity Fair, dramatized on true crime television, and later the subject of both a CBS 48 Hours investigation and an ABC 2020 special. Through all of it, the detail that mattered most tends to get lost. A 29-year-old nursing director, who built a career most people take twice as long to reach, who stood her ground when she was threatened, and who was, by every account that survives her, simply kind. She isn't a case file. She was somebody's favorite sister, photographed at her own wedding looking, in her sister's words, more excited and happy than anyone had ever seen her. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear Sherri's name, and subscribe, because there are more cases like hers, still waiting for the right detective to find that box on the floor. Thanks for watching.